Let me start by saying that there are two or three things that people think of as turning points that aren't turning points to my mind. I will start with the NATO expansion, first round in 1999, the second round in 2004. Many people, Mearsheimer in particular, consider this the original sin in deteriorating U.S.-Russian relations. I think if you look at the historical record, you will see that while Russia was not pleased with the expansion of NATO, it learned to live with that. In fact, in March of 2002, Putin himself raised the possibility of Russia joining NATO and said at that time that it was hard to see NATO as a real threat to Russia. So NATO expansion does not lead to a radical reassessment or radical change in the character of U.S.-Russian relations. There are also some people who believe that it was the Iraq War, 2003. Russia, as we know, was opposed to what the United States intended to do in Iraq, allied with the Germans and the French to push back against the United States. One of the reasons the United States did not go to the Security Council to get authorization for its operation against Saddam at that time. Again, I think if you look at the historical record, Russia was not pleased with what we were doing, but was prepared to live with the result and did not act in any way that actively undermined what the United States was trying to do on the ground in Iraq. To my mind, the area where relations deteriorated rapidly and led to a reassessment of relations with the United States and Moscow actually is the former Soviet space. And this occurs with the George W. Bush administration. The George W. Bush administration was actually fairly aggressive in the way it tried to assert the American presence in the former Soviet space, and also to limit Russia's influence in that region. So one of the first things that the administration did was push very energetically for the completion of pipelines, gas pipeline and an oil pipeline out of the Caucasus region through the Black Sea, Turkey, into European markets. It did this because by providing the countries of the South Caucasus an independent route to get the resources out, this particularly Azerbaijan, that it gave it a source of revenue that was independent of Russia, strengthened its own sovereignty for that reason. It also deprived Russia of the influence, the leverage it had over that region because of its ability to control the flow of resources out of the region. Second, if you look at what the United States was doing at that point, we were very supportive of a regional organization that was called Guam, Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, and Moldova at that point, as something as a counterweight to the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which was the organization that Russia wanted to use to maintain its security presence throughout the former Soviet space. In 2003, a Kremlin official, Dmitry Kozak, developed a plan to regulate the Transnistria problem in Moldova. That would have left a small Russian contingent in that area. The United States worked actively to push back against that, put pressure on the Moldovan government to reject that plan, which it ultimately did. But the big change comes in the fall of 2004, and it's bookmarked in my mind by two events. The first is the Beslan terrorist attack on September 1st of that year, when a band of Chechen Caucasian terrorists seized a public school on the first day of school. Everybody knows what a big day of celebration that is. Took over 1,000 people hostage. 3 days later, 3 or 4 days later, the Russian forces tried to liberate the school, I guess is the best way of putting it. In the assault, over 300 people are killed, 150 children. This becomes a tremendous tragedy for Russia, presented that way. 5 days after that assault, Putin gives a speech about how when Russia is weak, it gets beaten. Russia needs to be strong. But he also notes that there are some people who want to, as he said, bite off juicy pieces of Russia because it's a nuclear armed power, and they're only using counterterrorism, or they use terrorists as part of this effort to erode Russian power. He didn't mention the United States specifically, explicitly in those remarks, but it was clear to everybody whom he was talking about. And that, I think, underscored Putin's conclusion that the United States was using counterterrorism cooperation as a smokescreen for U.S. geopolitical advance in the former Soviet space at Russia's expense. And he had some reason to come to that conclusion. The counterterrorist cooperation with the United States after 9/11, that was supposed to be the foundation of U.S.-Russian relations, and never really panned out the way Putin had expected. The Russians provided us some extremely important support in the initial phase of the Afghanistan campaign, but we had provided relatively little to the Russians as far as their Chechen terrorist problem was concerned. In fact, we insisted that you had to look at the terrorists or at the Chechen rebels in two ways. One clearly was connected to terrorist organizations, but the others had legitimate grievances against Moscow growing out of the colonial past. And from time to time, we would urge the Moscow and Putin to negotiate with the Chechens, something we would have never considered doing with Al-Qaeda. One event that hasn't received much attention, but I think was very important in the way Putin reacted to the Beslan crisis, was that we had received an explicit warning through a White House Kremlin channel that if we granted asylum to a specific Chechen leader who was resident in the United States at that point, operating freely, talking from time to time from people in the State Department. We granted that individual asylum, that Putin would take this as a personal affront. Well, 3 weeks before Beslan, we granted that individual asylum. So Putin had a personal reason to react the way he did to Beslan, also more broadly because he had not received the type of cooperation he had hoped to receive in counterterrorism. The second event of the fall that changes Russian attitudes is the Orange Revolution. Again, if you know the history of the Orange Revolution, Putin had made a personal effort to throw his support behind Viktor Yanukovych in that election campaign. They run 2 rounds. Yanukovych is elected or is announced as the leader, and then there is this mass demonstration in Kiev against that, claiming that the election had been rigged. Under pressure, the Ukrainian government decides to rerun the second round of the election several weeks later, and lo and behold, who wins the second round of the rerun election? Viktor Yushchenko, pro-American, pro-reform, pro-Western candidate. And the conclusion that Putin and his colleagues reach in the Kremlin is that this is another example of the United States using democratic or democracy promotion as a veiled effort at regime change. But it goes beyond that. It's not only regime change in Ukraine. The conclusion is that this is really a dress rehearsal for what the United States plans to do in Russia in the upcoming elections, the Duma elections in 2007, the presidential election in 2008. And it's these two events, Beslan and the Orange Revolution, that lead the Kremlin and Putin himself to the conclusion that we finally understand what the United States' real goals are. They are eviction of Russia from the former Soviet space, erosion of Russia's territorial integrity, and its regime change. In other words, it is a concerted effort by the United States to deny Russia its status as a great power. And it's that, I think, that leads to the reappraisal of the relationship with the United States and to a qualitative change in the character of that relationship. We actually know this quite firmly for reasons that I can't expose publicly, but let's put it sort of mildly, that one of the things that the US government does routinely is steal other people's documents. And we managed to steal a number of documents. And at least one of them indicated that after Beslan, after the Orange Revolution, that all the security services, plus the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, wrote a memorandum to Putin that said, if we do not begin to push back against what the United States is doing to us in the former Soviet space, the United States is basically going to clean our clock, and that is going to be the end of Russia as a great power on the global stage. Putin didn't need a lot of convincing at that point. He had also reached that conclusion. And starting in 2005 and continuing from there, we see a strong effort by Russia to push back against what the United States is doing in the former Soviet space. But we also see an effort to do what I would call sort of hardening of Russia itself against the possibilities of a color revolution or regime change operation by the United States. This is the moment at which we begin to see the Kremlin crack down on foreign-funded non-governmental organizations. This is the time when the Kremlin greenlights the formation of youth groups. I was told by a Kremlin official at that point that they were setting up these youth organizations because they wanted the street muscle they were going to need to push back against any effort by the United States at regime change in Russia itself. So that's on the domestic side, hardening Russia against any US regime change operation in Russia itself. And finally, if you look at Russian activity in the former Soviet space, 2005, we see the emergence of a very active, concerted Russian disinformation campaign, particularly in Central Asia, to discredit what the United States was doing, undermine the local support for the two military bases we had, one in Uzbekistan, the other in Kyrgyzstan at that point. We see Russia welcoming the Uzbek decision to ask the United States to withdraw from its base in Uzbekistan after the United States refused to condemn what the Uzbek government thought was a regime change operation in the Fergana Valley in a city called Andijan in 2005. We see Russia push the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to issue an announcement at its summit about that time that all non-regional powers should withdraw their military bases from the region within 2 years. We also see a concerted effort by the Russians at that time to undermine the Yushchenko presidency in Ukraine, and something that they did quite successfully since Yanukovych was elected president in 2020 in what the OSCE at that time deemed a relatively free and fair election. So NATO expansion, to my mind, becomes a significant issue for the Russians only in 2008. And this is the Bucharest summit, when NATO announces that Georgia and Ukraine will eventually become members of NATO. And what we see here is really the overlapping of the two strands of geopolitical pluralism that the United States had been pursuing since the end of the Cold War: NATO expansion and encroachment on Russia's position in the former Soviet space. But it's only when it's Ukraine and Georgia, two countries that the Russians consider critical to the security and their prosperity, particularly Ukraine, that NATO expansion, to my mind, becomes a real issue and a real factor in the way the United States and Russia interact. So, final point, If you look at the fall of 2004, Beslan and the Orange Revolution, you can draw a direct line from there to Putin's speech at the Munich Security Council, Munich Security Conference in 2007, when he castigates the United States for its effort to build a unipolar world, and where he makes it quite clear that the major concern of Russia is the U.S. effort to deny Russia its right and role as a great power on the global stage.
Thank you, Tom.
And within 15 minutes.
Perfect, absolutely. Anatol.
Thank you. Just a couple of footnotes to Beslan. I entirely agree with you on its importance. It wasn't just the Bush administration. I was in Pakistan at the time, but I was trying to follow it through the Western media, and I must say, I was struck and somewhat shocked by the attempts by US and indeed Western journalists in some cases to avoid calling this a terrorist attack, to avoid calling them terrorists, to call it a siege, to put the blame for the deaths on the security forces and authorities, who clearly did behave incompetently, but rather than on the terrorists. And also the very long attempts in the Western media to deny the existence of this international Islamist force of Kataib in Chechnya, which, I mean, I don't know how far that affected Putin, but it certainly, I mean, among those Russians I know who read this, who monitored the Western media, this had a pretty bad effect. On the other hand, soon after Beslan was the first meeting of the Valdai Club. I didn't attend the first meeting, but from people who did, Putin spent great efforts, trying to persuade the Western participants, from the expert community, some former officials, academics, but also journalists. He made a tremendous effort to convince them of Russia's case on this. So he was clearly still, trying to influence at that stage Western public opinion and expert opinion. He had not at that point given up the hope of still, having a cooperative relationship with the West, though, or at least with the Europeans, but with the Americans as well. As you say, I mean, you could certainly see the beginning of a strong reaction. As Thomas said, there were a whole series of stages of deterioration. I mean, I'll talk about two that struck me particularly at the time. Not because they were actual sort of particular cases in themselves, but what they said about US approaches in general. And the first was when what has been called the Wolfowitz Doctrine was leaked in 1992. The defense planning, what?
Guidance.
What?
Defense planning guidance.
That's right. For the next X number of years by Wolfowitz and Scooter Libby for the Pentagon. And when I read this, I was then stationed in the former Soviet Union as a journalist. I virtually laughed out loud. I said, look, this is the kind of thing you get in the old James Bond films. When after Dr. Evil, or whoever it is, has tied James Bond to a chair, he says, and now, Commander Bond, I will reveal my secret plan to rule the world. Then, of course, Bond escapes. Everything is fine. But as you no doubt know, the Wolfowitz Doctrine has been described actually by one of its sympathizers, Walter Russell Mead, as an attempt to extend a hard version of the Monroe Doctrine to the entire planet. Only America will exert international influence. Others will have influence beyond their borders only insofar as this is in accordance with the interests and wishes of the US, and is pretty much explicitly allowed by the US. And the US will, to a greater or lesser degree, also have the, not necessarily always the ability, but certainly the moral right to intervene in countries to change their domestic political arrangements and policies. It seemed to me, reading that if this was adopted, it would imply confrontation and very likely war with a whole range of countries across the face of the earth. In fact, with any country that regarded itself as a great power, even in its own region. Because critically, what this was an attempt to exert hegemony not just on the world stage as a whole, and not just in the traditional areas, or well, at least going back to 1945, of US hegemony, well, much longer in Central America and then in Europe and maritime East Asia, but everywhere. And this was bound to create pushback from Russia, as if Russia did in fact recover, well, or even if it didn't, and from China, and indeed, you know, if the US had ever really engaged itself in that area, it would have faced strong pushback from South Africa, for example, as well. Now the funny thing was that at the time when this was leaked, it was very generally condemned, very much for these reasons in much of the US media and the expert community. But in effect, this became the standard operating procedure of every succeeding US administration, with, of course, variations. You know, harder under some, somewhat softer under others. In the case of Obama, more explicitly, you know, American unilateralist under Bush and Trump. But in effect, this is what the American establishment has aimed at, you know, ever since, including in the former Soviet Union. And that was never going to be acceptable to any government in Moscow, including, in my view, well, if we had ever had them, democratic governments. But for me, another critical moment was when I came back from Afghanistan in the middle of 2002. I'd gone there after the Taliban fell to look at the situation. And I had assumed, I mean, because of the, I mean, understandable hysteria after 9/11, that not just a concentration on the threat from Islamist terrorism, but that there would also be really serious concentration on the threat of state weakness, state collapse, internal instability and radicalism that in turn produced terrorism, especially in the Muslim world. And indeed, so much of the language in Washington and the money that was being spent on research by the US state and so forth would suggest the case. But I had very naively assumed that this would lead to a serious reprioritization of US policies in the world, basically towards cooperation against terrorism and extremism, but also a recognition of state failure as a principal danger to the United States and the global order. And also, I mean, even by mid-2002, it was clear to me that Afghanistan was not going well and was very unlikely to go well, at least as set out by us. And but when I got back to Washington, I found that, in fact, to a remarkable extent, priorities had not changed. China had, the importance of China had gone down. but there was no serious attempt to reconsider policy towards Russia at all, or to recognize, indeed, the role or the interests, really, of Russia in cooperation against Islamist extremism. And this, I think, then led in a way to another step in this downward spiral, only a step, but not unimportant, which was the response to the Arab Spring. Because after what had happened in Iraq and what was clearly also happening in Afghanistan, I found in Moscow incomprehension as to how the United States in Syria and Libya could basically set out to more than acquiesce in, encourage the disintegration of more Muslim Arab states with the threat of a tremendous rise of terrorism and of safe havens for terrorism as a result. And it was only later on, reading Obama's memoirs, I read something rather interesting, because in Russia, of course, at that stage, without being, shall we say, passionately fond of the Assad dynasty and the Ba'ath regime in Syria, was profoundly worried about the disintegration of the Syrian state and the implications of this for international terrorism, and of course, most particularly the fact that in Syria, fighting for the opposition, there were so many volunteers from the former Soviet Union and the Caucasus, including a good many Chechens. And Russia's attempts, well, in the end, very successful attempts later to prop up the Ba'ath state, or at the very least to lead to a compromise leaving the state in place, were tremendously condemned in the West. And Hillary Clinton described, when then Secretary of State, I remember, described them as despicable. Russia's support was despicable. Now, you see, it emerged in Obama's memoirs that in late January, early February, when the Mubarak regime in Egypt was in serious trouble and was beginning to have to shoot people on the street in order to stay in power as a result of the Arab Spring, clearly with the prospect that if it stayed in power, it would have to shoot a great many more people, there was a discussion in the US cabinet of what to do about this. And some said, including more or less eventually Obama himself, look, if we back this dictatorship in crushing popular uprising by force, this will discredit our entire international position when it comes to democracy. And in any case, look at what happened to the Shah. He may well fall anyway, and then we'll be seriously embarrassed. Others said, no, he is our ally, and above all, if the Mubarak regime is overthrown, we don't know what will happen next. There could be chaos, and there could be an Islamist takeover, which, of course, was pretty much what Russia was saying about Syria. Three guesses, about who was the leading spokeswoman for this position in the US cabinet. It was indeed Hillary Clinton. And I have to say, forgive me, Tom, but I sometimes wonder whether it is even possible to conduct a rational discussion of foreign policy if you're capable of keeping those two, not you, of course, but her and others, these two attitudes in your head at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Anatol. Svetlana.
Thank you. This was just tremendously interesting. I will start with a personal recollection, which is also a major turning point, and then I will take you back a little bit earlier into history we were having just a little exchange yesterday with Tom. I asked, so what is our time period for the turning points? And he said we could start with 1917. So I'm not going back to 1917. But and this will also indicate my internal biases. So I was in graduate school at Emory in 1993. Classes were going in the fall, and one day I walk into the political science department, and on the screen, on TV, there is CNN reporting on the shelling of the parliament. And so as I walk in, I see, my classmates kind of standing gathered around the screen, and they kind of look at me like this. And I come closer to the screen, and I see the parliament burning. It still gives me goosebumps today. I was not in Moscow, but the way I felt in that moment, it was for me the end of the democracy that I believed in. And of course, I grew up, I looked at this event more analytically, but still, I think for me, this event framed a lot of ways I look at what happened in the 1990s, at the missed opportunities, and at the nature of the government, of the regime that was developing in Russia at the time. And for a lot of people with whom I talked later, people who really believed in Russian democratic development, this event, very soon followed by the first Chechen war, changed our understanding of Russia's prospects in terms of its development. So that, to me, is a major turning point, both in Russia domestically and also in US-Russian relations. And very importantly, one of the major factors that led East European states to press very hard for NATO membership, because they also, like me, watched it on TV, except they were very close to Russia. And they thought, well, if this is what the best guys in Russia are doing, once they see opposition, what could happen if that opposition comes to power? And look, in the elections of the fall, December 1993, which I actually went back and observed, a very strong communist nationalist majority won. It did not necessarily mean that there was a transition in popular support for democratic development. A lot of people voted as protest against Yeltsin's party. It was a reaction, emotional reaction to the shelling of the parliament, to this terrible instability that was happening in Moscow, to the disbandment of the Constitutional Court, and simply to very harsh living conditions, the economy, which was mentioned before. So this, I would posit, was a major turning point, even though you did not see immediately any real change in US-Russian relations. I think one of the readings that I suggested was our posting that we did earlier this year about the January 1994 summit, Clinton-Yeltsin summit in Moscow. And if you read those documents, well, this is the height of cooperation. It is filled with conversations about strategic stability, about strategic partnership, about cooperation on all the issues, but it's also at the time when Clinton goes to Prague, goes to Eastern Europe, and announces that NATO will expand, and that it's the question of not whether, but when. And Russia was not in a position to put up any opposition, really, partly because Clinton supported Yeltsin throughout the constitutional crisis, as it was called, And right after the dissolution of the parliament and the attack on the parliament, he talked to Yeltsin several times and he said, "You're handling this brilliantly." Well, you know. Okay, so that's one. But I think, and this is where I will take you back into history, I think the most important turning point is in 1989, 1990. And here I would like to talk about the concept, which is very dear to my heart, of the common European home. And Nadezhda talked about it in her presentation. And I think the Charter of Europe and the summit, the Paris summit of 1990, so this period from somewhere middle 1989 to the Paris summit is very, very important. Events were changing, events were moving so quickly. And if you think that anything was predetermined, I would argue absolutely not. This was the period filled with most contingency, most opportunities, and also events that prevented people to make use of these opportunities. One of them, importantly, was the war, the Persian Gulf War. And before that was the process of German unification, which in itself was a great opportunity for Europe. But the way it developed precluded other opportunities, precluded other roads, and these roads became not taken. So somebody mentioned yesterday, I think Tom mentioned, that, maybe not, sorry.
Depends on what it is.
That common European home was very general. It was a concept not filled with detail. It was not a specific program. And it occurs to me that every time we talk about pretty much anything Gorbachev was trying to do, people counter by saying, well, but he didn't have a program. In the economic reform, he didn't have a program. He tried to do this and that, but he didn't have a concrete program, and he could not choose, with which I agree. In political reform, people say, well, he was trying to democratize, but he didn't really have a program. In arms control, he was saying he wanted elimination of nuclear weapons, but really, he didn't have a program, and that's true. Look at this. He comes to power in March 1985, and he has some views and some things that he really wants to do, like pulling the Soviet army out of Afghanistan and achieving some liberalization, not yet democratization of the Soviet political system, but he doesn't have a program. He could not develop a program on any of these subjects quickly. Yes, if he thought through, I want to do perestroika, I will build this team, and we will do this and that and that. But he was trying to reform the economy, the state, which was highly centralized, in terms of just the administrative, the way the administrative Soviet Union worked. He tried to decrease the influence, the role of the party, and increase the role of elected Soviets, local councils. All this together, so it's never been done anywhere in the world. That's partly why there is no program. But if you look at the documents again, at the memoirs, you see that within Gorbachev's circle of advisors, there was a program, there was a clear understanding of what a common European home would entail. It would be built on the structures of CSC. In Europe, the only serious European institution in which Russia, the Soviet Union, was a member and had serious influence. So it would have several elements: collective security, deep economic cooperation. It would have strong humanitarian aspect, and the fourth one would be environmental regime. So that program he presented in Strasbourg in the summer of 1989. Then in the fall of 1989, when they start realizing that the German unification is about to happen, the wall comes down, there are lots of contacts with the Germans. Georgy Shahnazarov actually writes a relatively coherent program of the common European home, how it would develop. I will not go into detail, but the idea is that there are so many processes in Europe. Clearly, Eastern Europe is leaving not yet the Warsaw Pact, but the socialist system as such. And partly, and I think to a large extent, due to their idea of the common European home, Gorbachev was not willing to use force. He also was not willing to use force in principle. He had a very, very strong moral aversion to using force, both domestically and internationally. So they saw that Gorbachev's circle of advisors, these several processes having certain priorities. So they believed that first you would build strong European structures, which they called the common European home. But a lot of it was taken directly from the Helsinki Final Act of 1975. And once that process was established, then you allow Eastern Europe to go, and then you allow Germany to reunify. Now, what's interesting, you could say, well, that was idealistic, that was unrealistic. There's a wonderful book by Mary Sorotti called 1989. And in short, she argues that essentially there were choices. And in Eastern Europe, and in Germany, and in France, there were a lot of people who actually supported the Eurocentric development of this new world. There were a lot of people who believed in gradual dissolution of both military blocs, including Václav Havel, who comes to the United States in January 1990, makes a speech to the Congress and says, take your boys home. We want both military blocs disbanded. He gets a standing ovation. But then the Americans explained to him that, well, you know, Václav, what were you talking about? Look, you know, NATO is the key to US presence in Europe. You want to be a good friend of the United States, we need to stay in Europe. So there were choices at the moment, but the choice was made because it was more easily understandable to use the existing structures rather than trying to build some new structures. And it was a great transitional period where, you know, everything was possible. The United States at the time, unlike the Soviet reformers, had a very clear view of what they wanted. They wanted to preserve their presence and influence in Europe. They also believed, the Bush administration believed that you know, if the Americans are not in Europe, all kinds of bad things happen. These Europeans, they can't take care of themselves. You know, you leave them alone, they get into major war. Look, World War I. America withdrew from Europe. Look, they got into World War II. And now what? Look, Yugoslavia is falling apart, right? The Soviet Union might fall apart violently. So the United States perceived a very strong interest in preserving NATO as the key to European stability and to American presence in Europe that in turn would guarantee stability. So this, I think, is really a major turning point, and people forgot about it because, well, people say, well, the dissolution of the Soviet Union was inevitable, and I think dissolution of the Warsaw Pact was inevitable. As far as I can see, the only inevitable process was the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. So I will stop here about this turning point, and the other just very short comment. I think NATO expansion was a turning point, except it had delayed reaction. And here I disagree with Tom. And I agree that you don't see a change in US-Russian relations. Not in 1997 when the invitations are presented, not in 1999 when when the first round of expansion happens, not in 2004, but what you do see, and I will take just 1 year, 1997, the opposition to NATO in Russia throughout the population, the entire political elite, is amazingly strong. You look at the Duma, you know, these factions, they can't agree on anything except one thing. They agree on opposition to NATO expansion. And they feel powerless and they feel humiliated. Yeltsin talks about it all the time, and yet it goes on. But what happens within the population and the political class and even the academic elite is that, you know, America cannot be trusted, America is encroaching, you know, NATO is encroaching on Russia, and the delayed reaction is a lot of what we see after the second wave of expansion. Thank you.